Welcome, welcome. Good to have you with us. We will get started in just a couple minutes here. We want to give people time to get in and get settled. Y bienvenido. Y si ustedes necesitan interpretación, hay un botón que parece como un pequeño globo en la parte inferior de la pantalla de Zoom. Hagan clic en él y elige español. Welcome, everybody. If you need interpretation, there's a button at the bottom of the Zoom screen. It looks like a little planet, and you can just click that and choose Spanish. And we will get started again in just a little bit here. So nice to see you all. If you want to say hi in the chat, go ahead. You can tell us where you're from, what you're excited about tonight while we wait for folks to trickle in. Oh, some people have I really like Vivian's background there. That's very cool. Nice to see you all. We're going to give folks just another minute or so, and then we will get started. Hello, hello from Oklahoma. Nice to have you, Nancy. I am from Washington State, the faraway Washington. Hello from Massachusetts. Awesome. Baltimore in the building. Yes. And Western Massachusetts and Arkansas, Western Mass, ancestral land of the Mohican people. Perfect. Oregon in Maryland. Love it. Okay. Well, I think we can go ahead and get started. So, welcome everybody. So good to be with you again. And I am your host, Aaron Scott. My pronouns are he, him. I am the staff officer for gender justice for the presiding bishop's office of the Episcopal Church. And this is the Gender Justice Jam. We are in our 10th week of this series, and you are joining us for our second week in a row talking about reproductive justice. Just a reminder, this is a program hosted by the Gender Justice Office of the Presiding Bishop's Office of the Episcopal Church. And so I work as the Gender Justice Staff Officer, supporting all of our churches, LGBTQ plus and women's ministries church-wide. We are so happy to have you all with us tonight. And we're going to start out with our land acknowledgement, which some folks have already been warming up in the chat. We're calling in from many different places tonight. So if you know the original people of the land you're currently on, please feel free to drop their name in the chat in honor and recognition of them. I am zooming in from Tacoma, Washington. So I want to acknowledge that I'm on the traditional homelands of the Puyallup and Nisqually tribes, as well as on lands with deep significance to other Coast Salish tribes. Coast Salish people have lived on and stewarded these lands since time immemorial, and they continue to do so today. And so I extend my deepest gratitude to past, present, and future generations. Thank you all for putting your land acknowledgements in the chat. Awesome to see. Tonight, slight change to our original plan. We were going to have two guest speakers. Unfortunately, Reverend Gwen Fry of TransEpiscopal is not able to be with us tonight. But we are super honored to be joined by our special guest and my good friend, Reverend Dr. Jessica Williams. So, Reverend Williams is the Director of Ministry Education at the Kairos Center for Religions, Rights, and Social Justice. She is a pastor and a theological educator who has served churches in New York, Iowa, Kansas, She currently helps teach at Union Theological Seminary in New York City and lives in the Kansas City area where she's active with the Kansas Poor People's Campaign and teaches in and has previously also taught at Central Seminary. And she is ordained through the American Baptist denomination. So we're doing our very best ecumenical work tonight. Thank you so much for being with us, Jess. We're excited to hear from you. And before we go any further, I think let's do what we usually do. We're going to ground ourselves in prayer, do a reminder for our covenant for safety and respect, and then just do a little bit of Bible study tonight. So if you have prayer requests that you want to lift up to us tonight, feel free to drop them in the chat now while we pray together. And we're going to be talking about the part of reproductive justice tonight that's really about having the right to form families of our choosing. So we're going to warm up that theme in our prayer. God, just as you have created each of us as unique and complex individuals, so have you knit us together in unique and complex families with no two alike. When we encounter in your word the sacred stories of families like Ruth and Naomi, David and Jonathan, and Jesus' own family, his unmarried mom, his two dads, his chosen family of disciples, we know that your love and your presence is not limited by cookie cutter definitions of what it means to be a parent or a child or a partner or a relative. Be with us tonight as we learn from your word, from Reverend Jess, and from one another on the ways we can support, protect, and uplift one another's families, especially those families whose divine right to form and come together in our own ways of choosing is under threat because of the attacks on reproductive justice and LGBTQ plus families. We ask all this in the name of the one who creates, redeems, and sanctifies all our families without exception. Amen. So we are happy to see you all back. We want to thank everybody who's made it to all these sessions so far. And if you're joining us for the first time, we're so excited you're here. We do this series trilingually, so it's English, and then we have live simultaneous interpretation in American Sign Language, as well as Spanish. So huge thanks to all our interpreters, Persis, Erica, Ricardo. Thank you for making the series accessible. And I'm just going to pause really quick. I think everybody's connected to the interpretation they need. Okay. And couple security notes. Just a reminder, we have a zero tolerance policy for bullying, harassment, threats, and hate speech in this series. So anyone who undertakes any of these will be immediately removed from the Zoom room by our tech team and will not be able to rejoin future sessions. And reminder number 2, we can debate a lot of things in this class, but we are not debating the personhood, sanctity, or right to spiritual leadership of LGBTQ plus people and families in this class. We are also not debating whether all people deserve safe and legal access to reproductive health care, and we are not debating whether people deserve to live free from violence in all forms. So if you have questions about any of those stances, you can refer to the General Convention of the Episcopal Church. Just another reminder, this is a public series. We record these sessions and then we post them to the Episcopal Church's website as well as our Spotify station afterwards for anybody who missed joining us live. So just be mindful of the information you are sharing about yourself and the people you love. You don't want to out anybody who's not already out, but you can ask questions about supporting people. So just don't identify them. Don't say, my grandson and I go to the same church um, in Birmingham. It's St. Titus, and he just came out to me as trans, and his name is Dave. Don't say that, but you can say there's a young person I love who just came out to me. I want to know how to support them. Likewise, just be mindful of the information you choose to disclose about yourself. We honor people choosing to share their personal stories, and we also know it's not always safe to do that. So just be discerning with what you want to share. And finally, if you have any tech issues, just drop it in the chat. Reverend Melanie, thank you so much for holding down tech today. We will be responding to whatever comes up for folks. All right, I think that's housekeeping. So let's do our opening Bible study. We do this every week. And this week, Melanie, if you want to put a Bible study up for us, we're going to be doing something that a part of scripture where a lot of people's eyes glaze over, and you're just like, I'm just going to skip this. I don't need to know these names. I don't know who these people are, and I don't know why it matters. We're going to read the genealogy of Matthew. So if I could get one volunteer in English and one in Spanish. I see Jana. If you want to go ahead and read this for us, that would be awesome.
All right, can you hear me?
Yeah, go right
Okay,
ahead.
great. All right. An account of the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, and Judah the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar, and Perez the father of Hezron, and Hezron the father of Aram, and Aram the father of Aminadab, and Aminadab the father of Nahshon, and Nahshon the father of Salmon, and Salmon the father of Boaz by Rahab, and Boaz the father of Obed by Ruth, and Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of King David. And David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah, and Solomon the father of Rehoboam, and Rehoboam the father of Abijah, and Abijah the father of Asaph, and Asaph the father of Jehoshaphat, and Jehoshaphat the father of Joram, and Joram the father of Uzziah, and Uzziah the father of Jotham, and Jotham the father of Ahaz, and Ahaz the father of Hezekiah, and Hezekiah the father of Manasseh, and Manasseh the father of Amos, and Amos the father of Josiah, and Josiah the father of Jeconiah and his brothers at the time of the deportation to Babylon. And after the deportation to Babylon, Jeconiah was the father of Salathiel, and Salathiel the father of Zerubbabel, and Zerubbabel the father of Abiud, and Abiud the father of Eliakim, and Eliakim father of Azor, and Azor the father of Zadok, and Zadok the father of Achim, and Achim the father of Eliud, and Eliud the father of Eleazar, and Eleazar the father of Mathan, and Mathan the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, who bore Jesus, who is called the Messiah. So all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations, and from David to the deportation to Babylon, 14 generations, and from the deportation to Babylon to the Messiah, 14 generations.
Thank you so much, Jana. You did awesome with all those names. I'm glad it was you and not me. Um, could we get a volunteer to read this in Spanish? If you want to put your hand raise button off or um, drop in the chat if you want to read this in Spanish. We could use a Spanish reader. It might be me tonight, and I apologize in advance, everybody. Oh, nope, we haven't. Thank you, Ricardo. That would be great if you could do it. Don't know if we need. Oh, there we go. Yeah, if you want to hear Ricardo, you'll need to switch to the Spanish interpretation channel. Thank you so much, Ricardo. All right, let's see. Melanie, if you could, yeah, go back one slide. Um, so I don't know who has had a chance to spend much time looking at this genealogy in the Bible or any others. Again, it is certainly most of the time a place in Scripture where I just flip to the next page. I'm like, I can't even say these names. So I'm going to, and I just my eyes start to glaze over. But I think for what we're going to be talking about tonight, it's helpful, and I appreciate Reverend Jess for suggesting this. Helpful for us to look at this because we are talking about families tonight. We are talking about the right to have families, to have our families respected, um, to have our families safe, to have the bodies of the people in our families safe and thriving. And so I want to say just a little bit, and then we can talk about it together. Folks are putting in the chat what they're noticing. I love that. What is the purpose of a genealogy in the Bible? What is the purpose of this one specifically, but also just in general? So it's important when you're reading these things in Scripture, and especially this one, to keep in mind this this is not a DNA test, and it is not a list of blood relatives. There are some included, probably, but it is not actually about that. It is not about proving genetic inheritance. It is not about proving blood ties. And that's not just because they didn't have DNA tests back in the Bible times. It's because they did not in the ancient world put these genealogies together to prove a point about um, your blood genetic inheritance. That was not what this was for. Uh, a genealogy in the Bible is a political statement. A genealogy like this is a claim on who a person is. So in this case, who Jesus is, and especially what kind of leader he is by virtue of who he comes from. So again, this genealogy is meant to tell us who Jesus is going to be before he's even born, because of who he comes from, because of his lineage. Um, so, with this genealogy of Jesus, it's important for us to notice the names, because those are supposed to be little signals to us about Jesus' spiritual and political pedigree, right? They're meant to tell us something about how he comes to be the leader he is. And I think I want to highlight that because it can get lost when, we do this thing in church where we like to make Jesus into this magic man who's like exists outside of history or outside of the mess and the power and the possibility of a real material human existence. This and that's not like that sort of magic man who exists outside of time is not actually a biblical concept, right? This Jesus who we meet in the Gospel of Matthew comes from real people, and so emphasizing all of that complexity of the generations that lead up to Jesus is very biblical. I want to say as a second point, this genealogy is uniquely inclusive of women's names. Um, you may have noticed some of those names here. You may know some of their stories. You may know all of their stories. I'm going to specifically point out if you missed them in this big block of names. Um, yeah. So we have here Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba, who here is referred to as the wife of Uriah, um, who is Uriah is not the lineage. David is the lineage. Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba, and Mary. All five of these women, uh, in some way, um, sometimes through the ways they were exploited or violated by other people, sometimes because of the ways they were in their own actions trying to navigate these societies where women had very limited options regarding, survival and sexuality. All five of these women have stories in the Bible where their sexuality is basically cast as suspect. And of course, there are many other women in Jesus' lineage besides these five women, but none of their names are mentioned. Only these five women whose sexuality is maybe considered questionable or maybe considered suspicious. Certainly, none of these women in their time and place have a sexuality that is considered like quote unquote pure. Um, uh, Only women in this category are lifted up and named in Jesus' genealogy. And this is important to notice. This is meant to tell us something about who Jesus comes from, about who he is going to be, and the life he is called to lead. So the inclusion here of Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba, and Mary is meant to tell us, communicate with us that God chose these women specifically, chose their line to come into the world and upend it. Um, and I just want to say that there's a lot more. I think we could have a little discussion before we move to Reverend Jess about what people notice here. But I just want to say that when we look at today, the ways that we're seeing, these definitions of what is a family, what counts as a family, which families are worth protecting, and we see the legal, the social, sort of religious, like Christian definitions of what's considered an acceptable family shrink and shrink and shrink. Essentially, until you're violently excluding all families, except those who are straight, white, cisgender, patriarchal, nuclear, married, financially stable, requiring no access to reproductive health care. When we see the definition of family shrink and shrink and shrink and become inaccessible to so many people, I think this genealogy becomes really important because it makes it clear that when you shrink what gets counted as real family or who deserves to make a family, that's really restricting uh, how God gets to come into the world, right? God does not come into the world through a lineage of straight, white, landowning, nuclear, cisgender families. That is not it. There's there's something really important for me in this genealogy that shows that God comes into the world through these very sort of unruly, unpredictable, sometimes heartbreaking, but always very complex realities of family. So I wanted to start with that, and I want to just leave a little space for folks to maybe share what do you see when you see this text, or what's jumping out at you? Maybe what's speaking to you when you hear about this genealogy. You can hit your hand raise button. Della's saying, yeah, it's real interesting that it goes to Joseph, which Marla shared too, because Jesus' stepfather's context is still influential. Yeah. Jana noticed that Bathsheba wasn't mentioned by name, only mentioned as the wife of Uriah. And also said, I'm in EFM year 1 right now, so I've been reading through way too many genealogies in the Old Testament, LOL. Praying for you. If other folks have thoughts about this genealogy, Kristen, go ahead. Or Kirsten, sorry. Go ahead.
Kirsten.
Kirsten, sorry.
Okay. I'm there are kings in this genealogy, and there's like a sort of a rise and a fall in the genealogy of like power and loss of power in it. And there's also among the kings a bunch of people who are really good at following the law and a bunch of people who are really bad at it. So it's like a motley crew of folks leading to Jesus.
Yeah, no, that's super, super valuable. And that's Laura is asking, what's the significance of the number 14? I think you're asking because alongside with all these kings, it's the mention of the generations from the deportation to Babylon. So at the end there says all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations, and from David to the deportation to Babylon, 14 generations. And from the deportation to Babylon to the Messiah, 14 generations. I don't know if Reverend Liz is on here, and I'm sure there's a meaning for the number 14. It is a multiple of 7. Thank you, Jana. Jess, I don't know if you remember too, but if anybody remembers this, it does mean something. I just forgot to check that. 7 is an important number in the Bible.
Yeah, Aaron, just real quick.
Yeah.
It's how many generations into Babylon and how many generations out of Babylon. This is timing connected to the Babylonian exile.
Okay. Got it. And so uh it's like as long as it takes to get into exile and then that many more generations to get out of it. Thank you. And then Jana's also saying it's a wide range from Tamar, a slave, to Solomon, who had how many concubines? Exactly.
Yeah, and just like I think it's both. It's just reminding us like of how long it took to get in.
Mhm.
But it's also kind of reminding us that we're in another imperial regime that needs to be toppled, much like Babylon did.
Yeah. Yeah, that's
And
super.
definitely all of those different women and like all of that's really important too. But it's like it's very significant to have this timing connected to the empire. Oh, sorry.
No, I love that. That's really helpful. And I like that too because I think it goes back to this this question about like this is meant to tell us about who Jesus is, right? So that we see like in this lineage, right, the rise and the fall and the rise and the fall of these of a people who have had to survive various empires, including the Babylonian Empire in particular. And Solomon didn't save people from that trajectory, right? Like uh building up, sort of little mini replicas of or trying to have kings in the same way these empires around them are trying to have kings. Didn't prevent the deportation to Babylon. But including that in this genealogy of the Messiah, who is goes on to contend directly with the Roman Empire is really central to this. Thank you, Liz. Any other thoughts about the genealogy? I see Kristen, yeah.
I don't know that this is relevant at all, but I'm not sure that was Ruth and Bathsheba, were they Jewish? Because it's supposed to run through the female line. It almost looks like it just was not paid attention to a couple places in the genealogy here. I don't think that's necessarily significant. It's just interesting.
No, I think that's a really good point, and I don't know the full background on that, but I think you are correct. Yeah, Jana saying Tamar was an Egyptian slave,
Okay.
and that's I think really important to notice that these are again like perhaps geographic, nation, ethnic, cultural affiliations aside, these are still the mothers, the foremothers, the grandmothers and great grandmothers that are being claimed by Jesus. And I think that's a really valuable highlight to bring that what is most important here is maybe not a belonging um to a particular fixed identity, but a belonging to people who are at the bottom of empire and surviving. I see Merrick's hand is up.
Hello, everyone. Um, when you were talking about the mothers that were mentioned in this genealogy, to me, it seemed like the mothers basically introduced a universal aspect to the God, in terms of the God of Israel. It's also bringing in people who are not of that lineage, thus making that God a universal God. And I think that they also bring that feminine side of God to that whole package. And then in reflecting on that, I think about the tenderness that David had for Jonathan. And I think that it's important to remember that we needed that balance in that genealogy as well. It was probably some sort of literary construction as well. Just my 2 cents.
Oh, I love that 2 cents. I think that counts as 5 cents. Thank you for sharing that. Um, yeah, I'm gonna be thinking about that. Any other thoughts on the genealogy before we welcome in our guest presenter for tonight? No? If we don't hear from anybody, I think we are ready to welcome in Reverend Jess Williams, Reverend Dr. Jess Williams. Jess, thank you so much for being with us tonight. And I said a little bit when I was introducing everybody at the beginning, but this is our second week talking about reproductive justice. So last week, we were super lucky to have Ken and Kelly Brown Douglas with us talking about reproductive justice. What is the right to have a family when you are surviving things, and to build a family when you're surviving things like systemic racism, poverty, but also trying to access reproductive health care. And this is our second week of that. And yeah, so we're really excited to hear from you and learn from you. And thanks for being with us.
Thanks so much, Erin. Very honored and humble to be here tonight with you all. Erin asked if I would share just a little bit of my kind of experiences and understanding and analysis around what's happening with access to or attacks on access to IVF or in vitro fertilization, which is one way that many types of families, many compositions of families choose to pursue building their family. So I am excited and humbled to be asked to do that tonight. So to start off, just a couple more things about myself and kind of the perspective I'm coming from within that and thinking about that. I'm a cis, straight, white woman who's experienced poverty for a large part of my life. And so I just want to start off by naming that, because as I kind of talk about my journey with IVF and as much difficulty as I had being able to access IVF, it's much more inaccessible for many other folks, particularly those within the LGBTQ community and within poor communities and communities of color. So those are some of the things I am. Some of the things I'm not is that I'm not a policy expert on IVF or legislation, and I'm not a medical doctor. So what I offer tonight is just some insights based on my own knowledge and experiences, but should not be construed as either policy or medical expertise. My husband and I went through 9 years of pregnancy loss, of failed fertility treatments, and a failed adoption before 2 successful IVF treatments in the last 3 years, through which we have our 2 beautiful, sweet children, one of which who was here earlier. And So that's the perspective I'm coming from today. And what I hope to talk about tonight is kind of a brief overview of what IVF is. Like many of the things that I know y'all have been talking about in this series, there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation out there about IVF. So I want to talk a little bit about what it is and what it isn't, and how and why IVF has been under attack, especially recently, but also how it's not just recent. Want to visit the Bible a little bit more, and then talk about what IVF and gender justice might mean in this political moment. So again, I'm not a medical professional, but I'm gonna share my screen here just to talk very briefly about what IVF is and isn't. Pardon me for just 1 second while I get this situated here. Can you see my screen okay?
Yes, it looks great.
Great, thank you. So like I said, there's a lot of information out there about IVF, and also lots of misinformation. One place that I highly recommend looking for information, and that I've drawn from some today, is from an organization called Resolve, the National Infertility Association. So they have a lot of great information on their website. And so this first definition here about what is IVF, or in vitro fertilization, actually comes from their website, which is very simply a process of combining an egg and a sperm in a lab to create an embryo. And it's part of a wider range of fertility options or treatments. Together, though, that range of options is known as assisted reproductive technology, or ART. And these are available to or these are technologies that are out there for those trying to start their family, whether it be hetero couples experiencing infertility, or LGBTQ couples and individuals, single women who want to have children, and many more. So stop sharing my screen. I'm going to go back and forth between my screen and you all a lot because I prefer to look at your faces. So what happens when a couple or an individual decides to pursue IVF treatment is, hold on, honey, I'm presenting now, is that to go through a cycle of hormone medications to help produce more and healthier eggs than what a woman would in a usual cycle. And then a short outpatient procedure known as an egg retrieval. Each egg is then combined with the sperm in hopes of fertilization. Some couples or individuals will use an egg donor, or some will use a sperm donor for this process. Some eggs will be fertilized and will grow into viable embryos, and many will not. I went through one entire IVF cycle in which we ended up with no viable embryos. Viable embryos then are implanted through a very quick procedure known as an egg transfer. Sometimes, depending on the type of IVF treatment, sometimes those embryos have been frozen first and sometimes they aren't. That's called a fresh transfer. Sometimes the embryos are tested for chromosomal abnormalities to find out which embryos would be not viable, because not viable embryos would then result in a miscarriage if implanted. There's a lot of misinformation out there about that testing, and that couples or individuals are using that testing to build their perfect baby. That's not what that testing does. It is basically screening out an embryo that would result in a miscarriage. Sometimes couples or individuals that have gone through IVF have remaining embryos when they have decided that they are finished with transfers, and sometimes they don't. The Resolve website that I mentioned before, as well as just kind of from my own experience, I just want to share a little bit about what some of the options are for those embryos, because this is a big piece around which a lot of the attacks are coming. So options for remaining embryos are storage of those embryos, so having those embryos frozen and storing them until use or indefinitely. Another option is called compassionate transfer, which is when the medical team works with the patient to transfer an embryo at a time when they're pretty sure that it would not result in a pregnancy. Another option is disposition of those embryos, and another is to donate them to research or to engage in embryo donation. So those are kind of the 5 main options. In my experience and in the experience of a number of folks that I know of that have gone through IVF, you usually have a bunch of paperwork you have to sign before you start IVF, and you have to make a decision at that point about what you will choose to do with those embryos. You can change your mind, but that is a legally binding document and decision that you make before you start the IVF process. So again, I just want to state that because there's a lot of disinformation out there around that too. Another thing that IVF is that it's really expensive. The average cost of IVF is $12,000, but it can cost as much as $30,000. And it's in the entire process itself is rarely covered by insurance. So share my screen here again just to show, this is again from the Resolve website, and kind of an insurance map that shows which states offer coverage and which don't. Most of these states that offer some amount of coverage, it doesn't necessarily cover the entire procedure. There's some. So some of the ones in orange or blue have a law that states that, or I'm sorry, these are states that have an infertility insurance law. But the vast majority of states, the ones in gray, have no such law in place at all. And then some have some things that are covered and some things that aren't. So when we think about this as a form of building families, as a form of healthcare, and just how expensive it is and is not covered by insurance in most places, it's just very, very inaccessible for a lot of people that would like to have access to it. The history of IVF is that the first baby born from IVF was born in 1978. And I learned from listening back to the first Gender Justice Jam that the Episcopal Church affirmed the practice of IVF just a couple years later in 1982. So moving now to just kind of why has IVF been under attack recently? To touch on that just a little bit and how that's related to gender justice. So first, I want to say yet again that while attacks on access to IVF have been in the news recently and are under heavy attack now, it's really never been an accessible medical treatment for many couples and individuals, particularly those in the LGBTQ community. Because it's expensive, because it's not covered. So it's restricted to those who have means to afford it. A lot of people that I know have turned to GoFundMe campaigns to try to raise funds to access IVF, or they go in debt to pay for it. And both of those are what my husband and I did to use IVF. Another historical way that IVF has been under attack is that it's been treated as an immoral practice for in some circles for a while. I remember when I was pastoring a church, when we were kind of just starting to think about what treatments might be available to us after a number of pregnancy losses. And I was gifted a book by a couple in that church about how God views infertility and reproductive technologies. And basically the summary of that book is that by us for pursuing IVF, that we were being sinful. So that was 9 or 10 years ago. So not even just like the most recent attacks that we're seeing. 1 second, honey. Thank you. And also through policies. I live in the state of Kansas, and in 2014, there was a Kansas state senator that had a sonogram performed at a committee hearing at the State House as part of an anti-abortion political stunt. And as part of that, there were a lot of warnings at that time about the language that she and others across the country were using with that to try to define when life begins, and that would in fact lead to more visible attacks on IVF. And that's a lot of what we've been seeing recently. So a question that is often asked is why would those who say that they are pro-life attack a technology and a medical intervention that helps bring about life? And again, this goes back to a lot of misinformation that's out there. And a lot of this is related to and is tied to reproductive justice, particularly related to abortion, the access to abortion, because of this question of when life begins and how that is being defined. Because if you were to say that life begins at conception, then these embryos or even pre-embryos, which is part of what happens before implantation within the IVF cycle can even occur, those are considered a child. That's what we saw in that ruling in Alabama Supreme Court earlier this year, that those frozen embryos are children before they're even transferred. And so that's a lot of where we're seeing some of these more recent attacks. And let me just share again my screen. Because in addition to like what we saw in Alabama over the summer, the Southern Baptist Convention made news by condemning IVF treatment, saying that it is immoral and telling Christians to oppose it. And just other similar kinds of things happening in both many denominations, but also in many states and at the state level. And a lot of this shows up a lot in Project 2025, which I think you all have talked about in some sessions. I want to touch on that a little bit more in just a bit. But much of the language and kind of the framework and outline for attacking IVF is really outlined within Project 2025. Thank you, sweetheart. So what does the Bible say about IVF? Well, it's a technology in 1978, so not a lot. We do know, of course, that there's lots of stories in the Bible about infertility and about pregnancy. And I just want to share a couple of the verses that are often used to oppose IVF treatment. So I actually got these from an article that was put out by the Heritage Foundation, which is the author of Project 2025, and that these are many of the verses that they list about why Christians should be opposed to IVF. So Genesis 1, be fruitful and multiply. Genesis 2, this is a quote from the Heritage Foundation article, that men and women are given strict boundaries through which they should procreate. One argument is that in Exodus 20:14, where it says you shall not commit adultery, that the act of IVF, particularly if you use an egg donor or a sperm donor, is an act of adultery. And then two of the verses that are often used also in the pro-life, quote unquote, pro-life movement, Jeremiah 29:11, for I know the plans I have for you, says the Lord, and Psalm 139:13, that I was knit together in my mother's womb. And so that verse in particular is often also used to oppose IVF. So it's interesting to look then at the scripture passage that we had the chance to look through today, and to think about actually why Matthew chose to include these 5 women within Jesus's genealogy. And especially in thinking about a lot of the Bible work that I know you all have been doing around how empires seek to control bodies and to control narratives around bodies. And so when I was, reading through the genealogy again with you all, I just was thinking about how Matthew here is really shaping a counter narrative to that kind of narrative that empire often puts out. And not about bodies and how they should be used, and not just a narrative that empire puts out, but then also very violent and restrictive practices and policies. And that these 5 women that Matthew included are women who either defied or subverted and or had fallen victim to empires, various empires, as we talked about, kind of not just one empire, but various empires that seeking to control women's bodies. And Matthew brings us then something different within who Jesus is and Jesus's calling in the world, and what this political statement is about where Jesus comes from and what that means for his life and his ministry. I think another piece of this, and I'm hopeful that maybe we can get into this a little bit more in the discussion too, because I know Erin and Liz probably have some things to add on this too. But another piece to consider, I think, is how the Christian church through the centuries has then also crafted this narrative around Mary and how she gets pregnant. And what that means for thinking about what it means to be able to have the freedom to build our families and access the healthcare that we need to build our families and be safe and healthy in that way. So turning a little bit now then into Project 2025. So one thing just to note is that while he was campaigning, Trump said that he supports IVF and that he would support legislation to protect IVF. But what we know about what he says and what happens is that those are not always the same thing. And Project 2025, in fact, is very clear that IVF, about the need for a ban on IVF, as well as abortion and other kinds of reproductive health. So on page 489 of Project 2025, for example, there is a proposal to establish what's called a Department of Life. And this Department of Life would replace the Department of Health and Human Services. And part of the job of the Department of Life, this is on page 450, would be to make fetal personhood a federal law, and therefore to ban abortion and IVF throughout the country. Project 2025 also very early on page 4, lifts up, quote, a biblical view of the family and the need for the government to be not just supporting, but instituting the biblical view of a family, this is directly from Project 2025, to maintain a biblically based, social science reinforced definition of marriage and family, is how they stated on page 4. Which is actually super interesting to think about if we read that alongside Matthew's genealogy. Like, what is the biblical view of a family as Matthew has given it to us? And as these 5 women have shown us. So we can have some discussion about that tonight, I hope. But the final thing I wanted to mention is kind of these more visible attacks on IVF are a little bit newer than some of the other aspects of gender justice and reproductive justice fights that have been going on. And IVF is often portrayed as a treatment for upper class white women, and for good reason, because that's often who has access to it. But the fight around IVF access is also a fight for reproductive justice for all women, for LGBTQ couples, and for individuals seeking to build their families in a variety of ways, in the ways that they choose. And so perhaps this could be a point of unity or of coming together. I love you too, sweetheart. Across these differences, because I think that in some ways IVF is a point of weakness for those who oppose gender and reproductive freedoms, because it actually can reach, it touches a lot of folks. 1 in 7 couples experiences infertility. So it has the potential to be a space for expanding or unifying in a different way some of the fight around reproductive and gender justice. So that's what I had to share. I'm really looking forward to our conversation going forward. Thank you so much, Erin.
Thank you so much, Jess. I super, super appreciate you just taking the time to both pull this research together for us, but also to tell us, in some really personal ways, where you're coming from on this. And I just think, yeah, I really appreciate your points, both about how this is a place where a lot of different people are struggling, a lot of very different kinds of families coming from very different places. Reproductive justice is something that touches, like, it's hard to think about who it doesn't touch. And uh, especially when you're talking through Project 2025, there's just it's so clear and explicit of the kinds of families um, that this worldview is really trying to get rid of. And it's so broad. It's so exclusionary that it's very clear that there's far more of us on the outside of that than on the inside. I have questions, but I want other people to get a chance to talk. So maybe let's open it up for Q&A. So if folks have questions, comments, or just things that kind of sparked for you with Jess's presentation, with the opening Bible study, uh, go ahead and let us know. You can throw your hand up or you can put it in the chat. I see Kristen. Go ahead.
Hi. I just think that this is it's been portrayed as so black and white when of course it's very nuanced. And I think it's just to pretend that I always think, like, if you're in a burning building and you've got two children there and a tray of fertilized eggs, which would you save? Obviously, you're going to say, people will claim like, oh, there's no difference. Obviously, there is a difference. And to pretend that there isn't a difference is just so disingenuous. It just amazes me that there's this effort to just pretend that this is like a completely binary right or wrong thing, and that there's no areas that for discussion or pause. And yeah, I don't know, it just I think that's just a reality that they're just pretending is not there.
Yeah, no, I think that's right on. And I think for me, it's really helpful, especially to have this conversation in a faith space, because so much of that lack of nuance is like framed in church speak and in like vaguely Christian sounding language, when actually, like, it doesn't reflect like most of the long history of our faith traditions, and many faith traditions that have far more nuanced views about life and conception and choice and bodily autonomy. I think that's a really good point. Jess, I don't know if you wanted to say anything to that. The chat's blowing up, so.
Oh, good. Yeah, no, I just really appreciate that point. As a Baptist, growing up a lot, I heard biblically based, whatever. So the biblically based family. But like we were saying, and what I saw some comments in the chat, that if we really wanted to center society around a biblically based family, it would be very, very different than what folks are talking about when they often say that. So I really appreciate that and the need for nuance around it.
We have a question from Beth in the chat. Do you have a good resource on the ethics of IVF from a progressive Christian perspective? Any websites, organizations, or books?
Yes, I should have had this prepared, but I will find the book and put it in the chat. I've been part of a group of young clergy who have gone through IVF treatment, and a few of them wrote and edited a book together. And so I'll find the name of that and put that in the chat.
Awesome. Thank you. Let's see. Terry saying, I used to think it was hyperbolic to say that there were a lot of people wanting to take away birth control or family, but I think we really need to speak it out and loudly. Yeah, I think that is becoming increasingly, rapidly, dramatically clearer every day. Sydney says, and the embryo is protected, but if it becomes a female, it is not on so many levels, right? Or born poor, or born black, or brown, or indigenous, or like, so, yeah, it's like when and whose life matters at what point. All very, very contextual. Jenna says, like everything else, there's this kind of essentialism going on. This is the quote unquote correct way to have a family, and anything else is an abomination. And it's actually I think, a really helpful comment too, because it's, I think for me, it raises this thing when we're talking about IVF and all reproductive justice, we're talking about as both this focus on like population control, right? Like in the interest of empire, but also this battle around the fundamental right to health care at the same time, and like who deserves that. And I wondered, I feel like that crossroads is so under attack. Like, Jess, I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, but that is something that came up for me in your presentation.
Yes. I don't know that yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And yeah. I don't say more a little bit, Erin, about what you were thinking there. I was slightly distracted looking for this book, and so I want to hear what you were saying again, and then I think I can build on that a bit more.
I think Jenna's point here about this essentialism, and if you have
Yes.
the correct way to have a family or be in a body or be a person, and then if you don't fit this very narrow category, everything else falls into the category of abomination. And I feel like that's just so especially live when we're talking about empire's vested interest in population control, a empire in crisis, and its vested interest in population control, controlling the right kinds of people having more babies, and everybody else forgets you. But then also like this crazy healthcare system that we have, this totally inaccessible for most people healthcare system that we have, that is so expensive and so exclusionary. And I feel like
Yeah.
IVF and reproductive justice in general exist at that intersection.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you. Yeah, I think that is a really key point. I mean, when I was kind of looking up some of the articles to try to find what biblical basis for opposing IVF, and this one around be fruitful and multiply was everywhere. But as you're framing that in terms of like an empire wanting to control a population and figure out or put forward a certain kind of population building. And so, but then, yes, this that relates so directly to who can access IVF, and so who can build a family in this way that they want to, which Yeah, I'll stop there, but I think that's exactly right. It's this piece around it's about control, and one of the ways that you can control is through accessibility of a particular medical treatment.
Yeah, super helpful. I see we have a couple hands up. Let's do Kirsten first.
So I'm thinking about all of the ways in which like reproduction becomes, or the ability to reproduce becomes the source of identity for women in the Bible. I've been thinking of the stories of Sarah and Hannah, and of Leah and Rachel, and the other two, I can't remember, Bilhah and Zilpah, and like how the inability to conceive becomes a way that people are exploited. And and I'm not sure what the connection here is with IVF, but I'm just thinking about how for many women, being able to bear a child becomes important to their ability to be a woman, and that not doing that becomes a source of I don't know, grief, or feeling not as good as another. So I'm kind of throwing this out there as like the idea that reproduction and the in the Bible and women's identity and IVF, all of these things have some sort of entangled themselves with one another. And I don't know, Jess, if there's something that you could say about how those stories get used in the IVF story, but I could see them not being used well.
Yeah, absolutely. Mostly they're used to say like this is God's will. And so what the stories of women in the Bible who are barren, who are infertile, who long for a child, that God is with them and God loves them and cares about them, but it's God's will that they don't bear a child, and so it's God's will for you to not have a child. Which is, yeah, just another way to use scripture to deny people of, what the title of our session tonight, to build the family, to exercise their choice, to access the kind of medical care that can help them to lead a thriving life. But that's how I've heard, both personally, but then also just kind of sleuthing around on the Heritage Foundation website a little bit. That's how those stories are used a lot. Which is also to take like a piece of grief and hardship that someone's experiencing, and then to kind of throw that back at them, that's God's will for them.
Yeah. It's reminding me of a lot of ways I've seen sort of anti-abortion activism really weaponize people's own grief around infertility, actually, and like pit people against you who are actually not pit. They're not like it's it's like this crazy thing of like a zero-sum game where like if some people want to have children and are and need, fertility assistance to have them, and some people don't want to have children, like as though you could be in somebody else's body and in somebody else's life. But it's also, I think that question is making me think too about thinking about those stories. I think it would be really interesting to think about those stories of those women in the Bible whose infertility is really bright, and looking at what are the empires they're navigating as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that'd be interesting. I see Lissa has a hand up too.
Yeah, I was just thinking about talking about empires and the political input of Project 2025. And I heard someone talking about this whole idea of personhood of an embryo or at conception. And she was saying, well, obviously, this is a political uh, empire. I mean, she didn't use that word, but control issue, because they obviously haven't thought through if, in fact, an embryo is a person, then what do you do about people who are not married, child support for an embryo? And she went through about 10 different things that we do for children that would be totally just crazy and impossible to, if you were really serious about the whole concept, it makes no sense. So that just hit me with this conversation.
Yeah. What you were saying made me I wish our other guest was able to be here tonight to really speak to their experience. But one of the things I was thinking too is a friend of mine who it, who recently her and her wife recently went through IVF, and she's now needing to find she's raising money right now to try to find legal support because even though she's married to her wife, she now needs to adopt that child because she didn't carry that child. And so that's an added layer of financial burden for them. And so there's a lot of other pieces to navigate. And so as you were making the point that you were making just now about just not thinking through all the ramifications of some of these definitions and things, there's so many pieces like that. And I think when that ruling in Alabama came down, that it really shook a lot of the I don't know if the IVF community is a thing, but just like a lot of people that I know that have or are thinking about needing IVF treatment, as well as those that do advocacy around, like the Resolve organization I mentioned, because and then a lot of family, and I think there were a lot of stories out there about it, a lot of families in Alabama that had started IVF that then were unsure if they would be able to continue because of that ruling and defining fetal personhood.
Yeah, I think that it's making me think of there's sort of like a panicked scramble that a lot of folks in the LGBTQ plus community are doing right now around a lot of these things, like what access to healthcare will I have for the next little while, depending on what state I'm in. What legal access to reproductive health care will my family have? And uh, so, some people are making very, very legitimate, very strategic, important decisions about, like, maybe my family will move to another state, right? Like maybe my family will go even to another country, like someplace where we have healthcare access, where we have legal protection. And then there are just so many people who don't have that option, right? Like it's sort of similar to what you were talking about, Jess, with like this being such an expensive process to access IVF, like also just being able to up and relocate to a state where you feel like the legislation is more affirming of you if you're trans, or if you are, you're a queer couple with a child and you need to do a second parent adoption. What state is that? Like adoption is federal, but state law is also a really significant issue. Traveling with your family, driving through certain states is becoming increasingly stressful for a lot of people. And I yeah, there was a list of suggested document changes for trans people that just came out last week in one of the Seattle papers. And you have 5 weeks until Inauguration Day, basically, to take care of these things, to take care of second parent adoptions, to take care of your identity, your name and your gender identity with Social Security, changing your birth certificate, all of these things. And it's like that piece of it too is so it's important, and like people, I'm in the middle of trying to figure all of that out too. And also like there's gonna be just so many people who are so busy just trying to survive that like with IVF, it's not even really feasible to think about things that way, as though we could do it on our own on an individual level. And I think that is the big thing about being church when we're confronted with these brutal empires, is that it is our job actually collectively to protect each other, to be, a security detail for the oppressed of society, right? For poor people, for people whose families are under attack on all fronts. Yeah. I see folks continuing to blow up the chat. Oh, there's a lot of good stuff in the chat. The book that Jess mentioned, if you're looking for the book, is called Birthed: Finding Grace Through Infertility by Elizabeth Hagen. Lots more going, lots of people loving. Kristen says, it's the name it and claim it garbage that the people who have good things, like children if they want them, have enough faith, and anyone who doesn't just doesn't have enough faith, blaming the victim. Yeah, totally. Oh, and Jen is saying, sorry if someone mentioned it already, but when we say IVF in this context, is that just IVF specifically, or does that cover other types of non-standard pregnancies like artificial insemination? Do the proposed legislations cover all those things?
Yeah, again, I'm not an expert on all of those, but I think that the reason that IVF is particularly kind of singled out is because of the way that procedure happens, where the egg is fertilized by the sperm in a lab, as opposed to like artificial insemination happens within the body. And so I think that's why there's kind of these court rulings and attacks on legislation right now. And they're all very much connected to the what we're seeing about attacking the access to abortion as well, because it's tied up in that definition of fetal personhood. So because in IVF that happens outside of the body, I think that's why it's kind of really focused on IVF right now.
Helpful, thank you. I wonder if any other folks have questions they want to ask, or reflections they want to share while we have Reverend Jess with us. Anita says artificial insemination could be considered adultery as well. I'm sure somebody has beat you to it. Yes. Yeah, Jess is saying it was lifted up as such in some of the articles she was reading. Mm-hmm.
One of the things I wanted to add, as I was kind of reflecting on our journey through this process, is it really drove home for me the need for, which we all know, this is what I'm going to say is not some great epiphany, but it really drove home for me the need for these decisions to be made between a patient and their doctor. There were just so many different, it's not a one size fits all sort of treatment. There's so many different things that can be done, that need to be done, that should be done or shouldn't be done, based on a person's body and situation. And I was so grateful that we had an amazing doctor to navigate all of that with. but it just really drove home for me that why these decisions need to be between patient and doctor. And so that was just another piece that I wanted to mention.
I feel like that's really a complementary point to the ways we could improve the culture and theology in our congregations around conversations regarding fertility, infertility, reproductive justice. Like I it's probably not shocking to most folks on this call, but like there can be such I don't know. Like when I think of the way a lot of churches do Mother's Day, for example, right? That it just really is a pageant for for anybody who has maybe not had fertility struggles or like really difficult relationships with their parents or all kinds of things. I think, and when I think about like those parts of our common life together, I'd always am trying to trying to think about like, are we doing this because this is something that Jesus wants us to do? Are we doing this because we're propping up certain images of what is the right kind of family? And in that also just really wanting to erase the ways that so many people are struggling. Yeah. Oh, Jana shared a link in the chat. Get your church to join www.sacreddignity.org. Yeah.
In terms of the role of the church, I think what you were raising, Aaron, is really interesting and important. Like I was saying earlier, one in seven couples experiences infertility. That doesn't mean one in seven couples uses IVF, but one in seven couples experiences infertility and therefore is navigating what that means for them and perhaps having discussions with their partner and their doctor about that. One in four pregnancies end in miscarriage. And churches aren't great about acknowledging those sorts of things. And then even more so adding in this piece around what that means for reproductive and gender justice and adding that into kind of this. So there's both kind of this like pastoral, a need for pastoral care around that, but also then this need for advocacy and organizing around these interrelated, this cross section that you were talking about, Aaron, and these interrelated pieces of how that then also coincides with lack of access to a medical treatment that could help, and sometimes that includes the kind of mental health treatment that is needed when a individual or couple is experiencing that. As well as the discrimination around that, just like there's all sorts of intersecting pieces of that. But churches are so, in my experience anyway, so not great at even acknowledging the initial struggle that we haven't even gotten close to kind of getting on the front lines of doing the work of justice for it in tandem with that kind of pastoral care that's needed as well.
Yeah, I feel that feels really connected to a lot of conversations I've been having with folks around specifically chaplaincy for trans and gender nonconforming people in this morning, like crisis chaplaincy, like people needing somebody to go with them to medical appointments and stuff like that. But there's specific ways that's specific to trans people, but like just I know as an organizer, like an anti-poverty organizer, like having another set of eyes in the room when you're having to navigate any kind of system, the legal system, the healthcare system, like whatever, social workers, like having another witness, like a nice church person, like doesn't even have to be the clergy, but that helps too. Like just like a third party witness, like you're going to get treated differently. You're going to get treated differently at the welfare office. You're going to get treated differently, like at the doctor's office. If you're uh, dealing with any kind of, systemic racism, like ableism, poverty, misogyny, all kinds of things. Like, I feel like this is a moment where our churches could really be doing so much, and it would take some training, but it's not rocket science. Like, it's not rocket science or impossible for us to think about training up a whole core of leaders, both for that kind of chaplaincy accompaniment work, as well as think about what we're going to do about this big picture. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Jenna says, I think just normal. Oh, Jenna says, I think just normalizing these conversations and not trying to skirt around the tough topics and the realities of life goes a long way. Like, be open and honest about how many people have received abortions, what kind of people get abortions, sharing abortion stories within the church. Yeah, right on. Well, I also lost track of time here, and it looks like we should probably wrap. Jess, thank you so much. This was really, 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 really helpful.
Thank you.
Grateful to have you with us. Thank you for sharing your expertise and also your experience.
Thank you so
And
much.
yeah, and thank you again to our amazing interpreters, Persis, Erica, Rico. We couldn't do it without you. Um, and we will be back next week, same time, same place. And we are super lucky to be joined by the Bishop of Brazil, the Primate of Brazil, and Bishop of the Diocese of Amazonia, Bishop Marines Basoto, who's going to be talking about the gender justice work that the Anglican Episcopal Church of Brazil has been doing in a very, very hostile context. Really powerful work. And we're also going to be joined by Reverend Nathan Empsall of Faithful America, who's going to be talking about, again, some of the ways white Christian nationalism in this country has been attacking gender justice and what Episcopalians can do to be part of pushing back against this. This recording will be shared on the Episcopal Church's website, our LGBTQ page, but we also have a Spotify station. So if you have Spotify, just search for Gender Justice Jam. You can even Google Gender Justice Jam, Episcopal Gender Justice Jam, one of those two things, and it'll pop up. Thank you all. Week 9 is coming up. They haven't posted it yet. So I see Jana's looking for week 9. We're a little bit behind. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord, and love your neighbor as yourself. Thank you all so much. Have a good night.